Hi everyone, my name is Anastasiia Lapatina and you're watching This Week in Ukraine, a video podcast from the Kyiv Independent. Every week, I sit down with some of my newsroom colleagues to discuss Ukraine's most pressing issues. And this time, we're talking about Ukrainian attacks deep behind enemy lines, in Russia itself. I'm joined by Kyiv Independent reporter Francis Farrell. Francis, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure.
So, Francis, a few days ago, the Washington Post reported that allegedly Ukrainian military intelligence, known here as GUR, was planning to launch massive attacks on Moscow on February 24th, 2023, so a year since Russia's full-scale invasion. The Post cited multiple classified reports from the NSA and CIA saying that this was going to be largely a symbolic operation, but the US was really worried about it, that it would lead to escalation and such. And they made sure that GUR postponed the strikes. So strikes in Moscow sound a bit shocking, but it wouldn't be the first time Ukraine attacks Russian soil. So tell us about those attacks in the past.
So Ukraine actually didn't hold back from attacking Russian territory with long-range missiles from the very first days of the full-scale invasion. The first recorded attack, as reported by Ukrainian journalists and Russian sources, although Ukraine didn't take responsibility, was on the 25th of February, the second day of the full-scale invasion. It was a Tochka-U ballistic missile attack on a Russian airbase just outside the border in Rostov Oblast, and a few Russian combat aircraft were damaged. So they clearly knew, it's full-scale war, it's total war in a sense, and we have the right to make these strikes. And then in the next few months, April, May, we saw more and more attacks against Russian oil depots, also close to the border. So Rostov Oblast, Belgorod Oblast, Bryansk Oblast. And some of these videos showed that they were drones. So Ukrainian kamikaze drones going across the border and hitting these oil depots, which were obviously really important for damaging Russian logistics. And so the next few months, we had a few more of these. And then the next really big special one, which everyone paid attention to, was not until December, when Ukraine struck the Engels air base, which is really deep inside Russia. It's further away from the Ukrainian border than Moscow itself.
Wow.
And that's the air base where a lot of these strategic Russian bombers kind of take off from to launch their cruise missiles against Ukraine. That was right in the middle of this time when Russia was attacking Ukrainian infrastructure with dozens of cruise missiles every month. And so that was really special because you could see that then, these attacks could have a real effect. They were damaging some of these strategic bombers. And then since then, in the recent months, there's been another uptick in kind of more drone attacks inside Russia, less kind of effective, but more dramatic in terms of where they're targeting. So we hear about new regions of Russia where Ukrainian drones have been found, including right up near Moscow. So that's when I guess you really get the understanding that if they wanted to, as the US leaked documents said, they could potentially hit targets inside Moscow.
Given the state of the war right now, the situation in Bakhmut, all of these reports of Ukraine running low on ammunition, air defense, an attack on Moscow, the capital of Russia that's like 450 kilometers away from our border with Russia, it sounds a bit too bold. Does Ukraine actually have a capability to do that? What kind of weapons has Ukraine been using to strike into Russia?
Well, in terms of Ukraine's capability to conduct these really long-range strikes, so there are 5 factors, I think, that you really need to take into account, like in terms of how much damage Ukraine can actually do. There's the range, like how far they can send a missile or a drone. There's how much explosive that can carry, so how much damage that can actually do once it arrives at its target. There's the accuracy, so can it really be directed all the way to hit something quite small? Of course, there's the enemy's ability to shoot it down. So how good is the Russian air defense? I know people have made a lot of memes about what is the air defense doing. And of course, there's the cost and the ability, like what actually does Ukraine have? And is it easy for them to produce more? Can they get them from somewhere? So with all these factors kind of limiting, I would say, encompassing Ukraine's long-range strike capability. There are a few different options they have. As I said, they used these Tochka-U ballistic missiles at first, but we know that they probably have basically run out of all of them by now. So they need to get more creative. With the Engels airbase strikes, Ukraine never confirmed it, but we have a lot of evidence. Russia said so themselves, that they used these really crazy Soviet-era jet drones that fly at basically around the speed of sound, and they were used for reconnaissance. So they weren't made to be kamikaze drones, but Ukraine modified them, strapped a bunch of explosives onto them. And
fascinating.
Yeah, and these have proved to be really effective, especially in the Engels base strike, because they can fly really fast. So you've got that. You can strap a lot of explosives to them, and they can do a lot of damage. They're hard to shoot down. Of course, Ukraine only has a couple of dozen of those on their stockpile. So again, those are more like shock and awe attacks because they can't do that forever. The other drones that we've seen in use since about a year ago, since those first strikes against the oil depots, and now we see them as well. We see photos of them being shot down all over Russia. Those are cheaper kind of propeller drones. So I guess the best comparison there is more like the Iranian drones that the Russians use as well. So they're quite cheap. They're very simple to design and build, but they are limited in some of those other factors. They're limited in the amount of explosives they can carry, and because they're just running on a little propeller, they're actually quite easy to shoot down. So these are some of the things kind of limiting what they can do. There's one other kind of secret super weapon that Ukraine apparently has, which is called the Krim ballistic missile, which can be compared to the Russian Iskander. Similar system, similar range, potentially, and the Russians have reported, we have no idea if it's true, the Russians have reported to have shot some of those missiles down as well. But we really don't know when, if they ever really used those. They just built a couple of them.
And what's the objective of these attacks? Do they actually help Ukraine militarily?
So again, here it's worth distinguishing between the attacks where they succeed. Some, real damage has been done that really affects Russia's war effort, to others which are potentially more symbolic. You mentioned the Washington Post article said this attack against Moscow was going to be symbolic. So when we talk about the ones where they've used these old Soviet repurposed drones, the Engels Air Base, there you have a tangible impact. You can say, some of these important Russian strategic bombers were damaged, potentially brought out of service completely. And same thing with the oil depot strikes. There you have a tangible result. But just like with lots of Russian missiles, Ukrainian missiles also get shot down. Ukrainian drones also get shot down. And that's the weakness, I guess, of these smaller, cheaper drones, that they can get shot down a lot more easily. So in that case, I guess the effect is more psychological. It's more about making Russians understand that the war is coming to them, making the Russian command understand that in principle, their targets can be hit much deeper than they potentially expected if they don't react accordingly, if they don't move air defense around accordingly, and so on. So it's a mix of these two, and it's a bit early to say. We know that Ukraine wants to escalate this and hit more and more of these targets deeper inside Russia. So we'll see later what the final effect is.
Does Ukraine have a legal right to strike deep inside Russian territory? Because of course Russia very loudly says that we don't.
Of course they do. It's very simple. You look at the way Russia's striking into Ukrainian territory, the way they're targeting infrastructure, the way they're hitting civilian targets. There's no question. It's in the UN Charter, Article 51. If one state attacks another, there is a right to self-defense, and there is a right to specifically to strike against the aggressor state. That's what happens in a state-to-state war, even though it's strange to think about, because we haven't had these kind of crazy state-to-state wars that we have now on our hands. Of course, a response attack should always be proportionate. It should always be necessary. But again, there shouldn't be really any question here. You look at the proportion with which Russia is attacking Ukraine all over, and you look at these difference in resources. Ukraine will not send one of these really cool Soviet drones they've got into an apartment building. They won't do that, and they haven't done that. So there's no question there. I mean, later on, when everything gets worked out in the courts, when they go over this war front to back, start to finish, I guess there'll be a final decision. But it's pretty common sense at this point.
So the recent U.S. intelligence leak mentioned that the U.S. actually wasn't giving Ukraine long-range weapons that the Ukrainian government has been asking for months, in part because they intercepted Zelensky talking to somebody from the administration about attacking Russian territory, even though publicly the Ukrainian government was denying this possibility and saying that they would never do that. What I find interesting is, why is that a problem to begin with? Like, why was the U.S. so afraid that Kyiv would attack deep inside Russia?
Yeah, so publicly, like, the first concern was very, very open, that they were concerned that Ukraine would immediately, for some reason, break any agreements that they might have had about these weapons and immediately start using them against Russian territory. And I guess that was the worry, that high-quality, advanced U.S. weapons would already be used straight against Russia, and that, I guess, in the Russian mind, I mean, the U.S. fear was that in the Russian mind, where we're fighting NATO, we're fighting the whole West, that would be a very direct path to escalation. But then again, at the same time, it doesn't really match their logic of what they actually did, because in summer last year, they gave Ukraine these HIMARS systems, which obviously have proved to be very effective. And the HIMARS system has one rocket, like a guided rocket, with a range of 80 kilometers. And they gave Ukraine that. In theory, like, Ukraine has a border with Russia, so I'm sure there are plenty of targets that Ukraine could use these 80-kilometer rockets against in Russia, if they were ready to break that trust, if they were ready to just use those against Russia. And so in that context, it doesn't really make sense for the US to then say, oh, we'll give you the 80-kilometer ones, but we won't give you the 300-kilometer ones. And those 300-kilometer missiles for the HIMARS system, they're called Attack-MS. There's been a lot talked about them. There's a lot of speculation that somehow they've been given secretly, but we don't have much evidence of that. And the US is still saying that they're not going to give them, which is a shame, because with that range, Ukraine could target anything in occupied Crimea. Ukraine could target the bridge itself. So that operational aspect of cutting off Crimea would really work straight away. But they are still refusing to give it, and their reasoning is less and less logical, I would say. Recently, one of the spokespeople said that, and this is what they talk about when they talk about jets as well, F-16s, they say that Ukraine can basically do what they need to do without these.
But then at the same time, they say that they're not sure that our counteroffensive is going to go as well as we're advertising it.
It is a deeply, deeply flawed logic. Ukraine's success, especially with these really tricky offensive operations, and Ukraine's success in the rest of the war depends almost directly. It's a direct function of the material help that Ukraine is given. And HIMARS, when it first arrived in summer last year, it was a game changer. And these new ranges potentially of long-range weapons or of fighter jets could also be a game changer. Will also be a game changer. Like, it's not really under question. So it's a shame what they have done, and in a way, this almost proves how broken their logic is, and how ridiculous the fear of escalation is at this point in the war. They have given Ukraine what's called the ground-launched small-diameter bomb.
And what's that?
Which is basically a rocket also for the HIMARS system, with a range of 150 kilometers. So it flies around and then it kind of glides with wings and it can go a bit further. It can evade enemy air defenses, and it's a really interesting weapon because it's just been developed in the past few years, and it hasn't been used by anyone before.
Oh, wow.
Ukraine's going to be the first operator of this, and we'll see. It potentially might be easier to shoot down by Russian air defense, but it could also be another game changer, which raises the question: why not just go all the way and give Ukraine what it needs? But we've been here before. Yeah.
There have also been dozens of these kind of ominous fires around Russia, at oil depots you've already mentioned, but also factories, various storage facilities. Do we know if Ukraine is behind this as well?
You're right about the fires. Russia is burning a lot more than usual. There was a study done by this Ukrainian open source intelligence investigative group called MOLFAR, which recorded over 200 kind of industrial facility fires all across Russia in the first 3 months of this year, which is about double the normal rate. There was 400 or so in the whole of the previous year. And those are concentrated in industrial facilities, specifically potentially energy facilities. And a lot of them were around Moscow Oblast, actually. So, yeah, we don't know, we can't know, like, what has actually caused all these hundreds of fires, but there's a specific tendency of them going up, with the war. Ukraine has talked about a very, very top secret initiative called the Black Box, which had a few $1 million in investment from the Come Back Alive Foundation, and they have said that through this black box, they have done millions of dollars of damage to Russia, vaguely, but they have said that it has affected their ability to fight on the battlefield.
And nobody knows what is this weapon in the secretive black box.
No, nobody knows. People write articles saying inside the black box without any idea of what this black box actually being. So it's probably, to be honest, probably a mix of things. Probably Ukraine has had their hand in some of them. You could also have local anti-war groups. We know about how they set fire to military enlistment officers in Russia quite often. So they could definitely be playing a role there. And also just general economic conditions, insurance scams, those things. But Russia's certainly burning a lot. That's for sure.
There's another part of this discussion that we haven't touched on at all yet, and that's Ukrainian strikes inside occupied Crimea. So how is our activity there different from attacks inside the Russian Federation?
I mean, the first important distinction to make is that Crimea is Ukraine. So there's no questions whatsoever of legality, of escalation. Even the US said, like, Ukraine has every right to hit Crimea with whatever they want. Because Crimea is Ukraine. So, it's no different to Ukraine striking military targets in occupied Donetsk Oblast, near Mariupol or Melitopol, even though it's been occupied for longer. There's no difference whatsoever. And in that sense, it's also closer to Ukrainian-controlled territory than a lot of these strikes deep inside Russia. So there are more options potentially for Ukraine to use. And in summer last year, again, there was some really spectacular attacks. I think listeners will remember the attacks in the air bases in Crimea, which were all just within a few weeks of each other. Potentially several dozen aircraft damaged. We still don't know exactly what weapons were used there either. It all comes back to this question of what Ukraine's long-range capabilities really are. But yeah, it's also worth mentioning that Crimea is a very high concentration of Russian military equipment and logistics. It's a center for them for that. And so yeah, the more options Ukraine has at their disposal to attack Russian targets in Crimea, that has a very direct, very tangible effect on Russia's war effort in the east, in the south of Ukraine.
Do partisans play a role in these attacks?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly what they do in terms of these longer range strikes that Ukraine is doing. It's very, very likely and possible that they have a role in identifying targets, in pointing out where Ukraine could see a window, see an opportunity to strike something that might not be there for a long time. So as an example, there's this really cool partisan group in southern Ukraine, which is also active in Russia, according to their social media. It's called Atesh, which comes from the Crimean Tatar word for fire. They have a really cool logo. And they're made up of Crimean Tatars, of Ukrainians, of some Russians as well. And, you know, they talk about their work, and it's sometimes symbolic, sometimes just spray painting, you know, that Ukraine's coming, but sometimes they also, you know, they do real partisan work as well. They blow up railway lines, they attack potentially equipment. They say that they've destroyed Russian equipment, and it's very likely that they play an active role in also identifying targets for Ukrainian strikes inside Crimea and inside Russia as well.
You've mentioned that there have been attacks that Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility to. So let's talk about the Ukrainian government's response to all of this. Are they claiming responsibility?
So with Crimea, yes. They don't necessarily say immediately that this was us, but we know more or less. There are all these memes and jokes, and sometimes the Ukrainians really get into it on a state level, on an official level, these trolls about Russians, you know, should be more careful about where they're smoking. They need to be more careful with fire safety rules because, if you smoke in the wrong place, you know, next minute you've lost a dozen fighter jets.
Ukrainian general staff, I think, actually posted these things in their official Twitter.
They love that stuff. But in September last year, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, the one and only, actually said that yes, the airfield strike in Saki, that was Ukraine. He said it was a missile strike, although he still didn't make it very clear what kind of missile, and we still don't know what they used there. And in that interview, actually, Zaluzhny, he actually talked a lot about the motivations for these kind of deeper strikes into Crimea and in Russia as well. It's worth remembering Crimea is Ukraine, but it has been occupied for 9 years now, and Russians treat it as Russia. So he was really saying that the aim of these strikes in many ways is to kind of physically transfer the zone of hostilities. That's how he said it. So basically to bring the war home to Russia, to understand that they can't just live their normal lives and kind of not be involved, and that if something doesn't happen, you know, the war will come to them. This psychological aspect also worked really well with the Crimean bridge attack, and Ukraine still hasn't claimed responsibility for that. We still don't know exactly how that was carried out, but that's basically the same way that Ukraine has treated the strikes inside Russia as well. They're being very ambiguous about it. They never actually say, yes, this was us, even though sometimes it's very obvious. And another person who comments on this a lot is the head of this GUR military intelligence organization, Kirilo Budanov, who has also become quite an iconic meme figure for the way he kind of stoically responds to questions, keeping all the cards to his chest, but also giving away quite a lot at the same time.
Did Ukraine strike a Russian airbase?
I can't give you an answer right now on this question.
He was interviewed, I think it was in January or December after the strikes in the Engels Air Base, and he was asked, you know, how did you feel about this? He said, very good, you know, very, very, very happy.
I'm very glad to see this.
Yeah.
That's my reaction.
That's your reaction. You're happy to see it happen.
Yeah.
And he still didn't claim responsibility. He didn't say it was us. But then he was asked, can we see more of these in the future? And he, you know, deeper inside Russia. And he just said, deeper and deeper.
Inside Russia? Deep inside Russia?
Deeper and deeper.
So that's kind of Ukraine's approach to this. They know it's kind of psychological. I think that he was Budanov especially was a little bit rattled by the leaks. Budanov understands that there's this tension with Washington about strikes inside Russia, so he was potentially a little bit rocked by these leaks. And so responding to questions later, he was a a bit more cautious, and he didn't comment about these planned attacks on Moscow or anything. But at the end of the day, it's all out in the open. We know that Ukraine has been doing this. We know their reasons for it, and we know that they're going to continue to develop and improve on this in the future.
And what about Russia? How is the Russian society and the Russian government reacting to these attacks?
I mean, at first they didn't really know how to react, because on one hand, Ukraine's attacking them, and they want to talk about this war being existential for Russia as well. But at the same time, there's always this real reluctance to admit that something went wrong in Russian and Soviet kind of public relations culture. And so that was the case way back with the sinking of the Moskva cruiser. And it's the same thing. So they were at first not sure. Now they're slowly talking about it more. They're saying that these are Ukrainian drones, and they're trying to, turn the narrative more into, look, we are being attacked ourselves. There's always a flip side to this narrative of bringing the war to Russia, because Russian propaganda also uses it as well. Like, we need to win this war. We need more mobilization because they're coming for us now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's the psychological effect is working in another way, in the sense that they are obviously concerned. They realize that Ukraine has this ability that they didn't think they had before. And the funniest thing was when they put these Pantsir mobile air defense systems on strategic roofs inside Moscow, including, it looked ridiculous. So many memes were made out of it, including on the roof of the Russian Defense Ministry. Right?
Just one air defense system on the roof.
One or two, yeah, and a few other like key buildings in Moscow had these like ridiculous huge air defense systems right on the top. And yeah, there's no better way of telling the world that you're quite worried about this threat. I guess. Yeah. But otherwise, they can't really react. They can't really escalate in any way, which goes back to where like this U.S. logic is quite flawed, because Russia doesn't have basically the tools to escalate in any new way with conventional weapons that we know of. We know what happens when they try and use all their cruise missiles at once. We know that they're running out of them. There's nothing more that they could do.
Well, there are still nuclear weapons, including tactical ones, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the major American worry.
When it comes to nuclear weapons, I can just say that they're not in the picture at the moment in the Kremlin's decision making.
You sound very much like Budanov now.
I'm trying to channel him a little bit, although I don't have all the information that he has. But no, I don't think they're considering this. I think that they're very aware that would cross a huge red line, be unprecedented in international relations in general, and they're not going to do it because a Ukrainian drone made it to Moscow. If it ever comes into the picture, it will come into the picture when Ukraine is on the brink of winning this war completely, like taking back Crimea. Then maybe they'll be thinking about it, but until then, no worries.
Don't worry about this.
We're now going to be answering some questions that we got from our supporters on Patreon. Our patrons actually get a chance to ask us questions before every single episode. They also get exclusive access to thematic events like discussions with editors and more. It's really simple. You can get such access by going to patreon.com/Kyiv Independent for as little as $5 a month. So the first question is, if you could give an explanation of the difference between partisan attacks and government forces.
Yeah, it's a pretty good question. At the end of the day, I think there's always a spectrum of cooperation, like of the level of cooperation between like local groups on the ground in occupied territories, potentially even in Russia. We know there are partisans in Belarus, that's for sure. So the level of coordination and cooperation and potentially like taking orders from Ukrainian security services. We know that they're definitely in contact. It's very easy for them to be in contact. If they see a new like temporary base where dozens, hundreds of Russian soldiers or a couple of tanks have moved in, it's very easy for them to let Ukraine know, because maybe they don't have the means to blow them up, but Ukraine does, and so they'll send the coordinates.
And Ukraine actually has a whole body dedicated to this kind of work, right?
Yeah, it's called the National Resistance Center. They actually publish quite a lot about the achievements that they've done together with partisan groups on the ground. It's hard to say if there are, actual units remaining inside occupied territories that just take all their orders from Ukrainian security services. But again, it's about coordination and cooperation.
Another question that we got is it possible that the Ukrainian armed forces could launch a part of the counteroffensive that's upcoming from behind enemy lines across the Russian border?
It's an interesting question because Ukraine always surprises us in many ways. We didn't expect the Kharkiv counteroffensive. We didn't expect the Crimea attacks. We didn't expect the Crimean bridge explosion. And yet here we are. We didn't expect the Engels base attacks, and yet here we are. So anything could happen, but still I would say the likelihood of that is very, very low, because when you're talking about an offensive, you're talking about boots on the ground, and you're talking about actually taking territory. We had these weird raids in Bryansk Oblast from a kind of far-right Russian group that was connected with kind of in coordination with Ukraine, but Ukraine said that they didn't give the orders for them to go into Bryansk Oblast, and they didn't really do anything. They went into a village and said, "We're here," and then they
Took
left.
some photos.
Yeah. When you're talking about a large-scale offensive, first that would need to make strategic sense, and it doesn't make much strategic sense to go into Russian territory when you have so much of your own front line that is occupied where it's your territory. Secondly, again, that's boots on the ground. That's kind of taking territory inside Russia's internationally recognized borders, and that's where I think, even if it did make some kind of strategic sense, I think they would not go so far. We know what the US thinks about certain attacks in Russian territory, and if they thought Ukraine would actually think about holding territory, even temporarily, they would not be happy.
Well, Francis, thanks for joining us again. This was very interesting.
Thank you. Always a big pleasure.
Also this week, the New York Times reported, citing several American officials, that the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive may start as soon as in May. President Zelensky had a phone call with the Chinese leader Xi Jinping for the first time since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal announced that 2 cities and 4 villages around Ukraine, which were badly damaged by Russia's full-scale invasion, will be, quote, completely restored, in line with Ukraine's Build Back Better efforts. You can find our show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday morning. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to us and like our content whenever you're listening to this podcast. Also, support the Kyiv Independent on Patreon at patreon.com/Kyiv Independent, and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. We'll be back next week. Thank you for watching. Times reported, citing several American officials, that the long-awaited Ukrainian counteroffensive may start as soon as this May. Obviously this May, Nastya. Obviously not next May. That would be so funny if they were like, well, we said spring, but we didn't specify the year.